Okay, I'm going to start this. Sebastian and I are going to cover sort of the cultural aspect of the seed, going from choosing the right crop, which I'm going to start with now, and then all the way through like some of the growing techniques through the season, and finish this session with the rough harvesting, the removing of the plants and getting the rough seed out of the field. And then after lunch, we're going to talk more about the actual seed cleaning, the finished cleaning and so forth. So anyway, when we're talking about this, this subject, the first thing is, before we do anything, is like, are we dealing with the right crop for us? Because so often it's hard enough. Agriculture is hard enough without us throwing more obstacles at it. And so we really want to have all the we want to have all the advantages we can gain from having the right material for our farm. And so this is something we all really need to think about before we jump in there and just start planting. Although that's great too. I encourage people to experiment, but really when we get serious about seed growing, we have to really, first of all consider, are we actually growing the right crop? And it really starts with something that we just have a real deep love for. I think a lot of this work is a labor of love. It's probably not the kind of work that you're going to get rich doing. So if all of you that are hoping this is maybe a get-rich-quick scheme, maybe we don't have to waste your time and you can leave now. But for the rest of you, I think that this is where it really starts, is that inner passion, and really what we want to do with all this is we want to introduce this to the society at large. This isn't just about us and feeding our own little desires, but which is where you need to start. But it's really getting this material out to the world. So that's what we're doing when we're growing this biodiversity. We want to bring it out into the culture again. So and then we ask ourselves, well, what do we have any personal experience with this? And that's you may not. It may be something that's brand new to you in terms of actually growing seed. And then I'm going to talk a little. I'll talk a little bit about the suitability in terms of climate. And then we mentioned something about the weedy relatives. I think we have to consider that aspect. And then there's the disease and pest issues that invariably come up when we're trying to grow seed. And then there's, as we step it up and we start producing it at a more, maybe a little more commercial level, we got to kind of look at how seed growing fits into our daily lives. How does it fit into our farm in terms of, is it a good fit? Does it work with our crop rotations? Do we have the labor, and are the right pollinators around? And then the question of the market. And I think and then some of the economic considerations. So these are all kind of the basic questions before we even get started. I think it's really good to go through this exercise. So in terms of climates, and I'm going to be really concentrating on the 9 most important vegetable crop families. That's really what we're talking about here. Although, a gentleman mentioned some of the wild stuff, and we certainly can take this out to all species and crops, but for the sake of this workshop, we're going to focus on the vegetables crops. And of the 9 basic families, there's sort of the 4 kind of four categories that we break it down into in terms of their climatic requirements. And three of them involve the dry-seeded crops, so all the crops that produce a seed in a pod or a husk. And then the fourth is the wet-seeded crops, which are enveloped in a fleshy fruit. So, and then the two times that we've kind of broken it into are the sort of the flowering and early seed development period, and then the finishing seed development period. And they're a little bit different. And you'll see that in the late seed development, the temperatures tolerated are a little bit higher. So, and it's kind of, that's naturally flows that way when you consider a season. As you get later in the season, toward late summer, for say, it's going to be warmer. And these are only general guidelines, and I think that don't take this as being the gospel of all gospels, but I think it's a good guide. And so you can kind of see how it's broken up. A lot of the amaranth family, which includes beets and spinach and chard, those are what we call more or less the cool season dry-seeded crops. Chard, perhaps, I've got chard listed in the warm-seeded dry as well, because that has a little more flexibility. And varietal difference will change too. Some varieties are more heat tolerant, some are not. So that's, there's some flexibility there. Broccoli, most of the brassica are cool season, what we call cool season dry-seeded crops, but the broccoli actually requires a little bit more warmth. It's an annual as opposed to cabbage and, Chinese cabbage is an annual too, but a lot of the biennial brassicas like cabbage and cauliflower like it a little cooler. Broccoli tolerates warmer. And then peas, surprisingly, this came from John Navasio's book, The Organic Seed Grower, which is over on the table there. And John had listed peas as a warm-seeded crop, and I've thought of it more as a cool, but actually for good seed development, it likes the temperatures a little higher than you may think. And then some of the hot-seeded dry crops, carrots, onions, and corn. And like carrots, for example, really, and both carrots and onions tend to be, they can go with cooler weather, but they don't really thrive in it. And what we're really trying to do is find the optimum environments here. So we want something that truly thrives. And then finally, all the wet-seeded crops, most of them we consider hot season, where during the late seed development, they like 75 to 95, with the exception of cucumbers. I kind of stuck cucumbers at the end there. They actually like it a little cooler than the rest of the cucurbit family. And I think maybe they're the trickiest of all the cucurbits. So anyway, this is again, it's covered in John's book, but this is where we need to start. Okay. Now, day length is something that sometimes people don't think about, but day length being like the amount of day hours that we can actually grow a crop, and up, say, in Washington State, it's a long day, and in Arizona would be a short day. Just kind of the comparison there. And for onions is perhaps the most day length dependent. Most onion varieties, and they require that they'll really be affected by what I'm calling neck closure. And say if you take an onion that's developed under a long season, so say in Washington or in Canada, where the onion really requires a long day to form, to bulb up, and then get nice neck closure. If you bring that onion too far south, like say you have an onion that's developed for British Columbia and you bring it to Arizona, oftentimes, and this Rosa di Milano, which is an onion I've grown, and it's a great Italian heirloom, sort of demonstrates it a little like like this neck right here, a little bit fat, you know, and it's because Rosa di Milano comes from northern Italy, and I was growing, and that's about 45 degrees latitude, and I was growing this at about 37 degrees latitude in central California. So it's a little bit, our days are a little short down there. The onion actually doesn't fully form before it finishes. And what the implication is for that is that, you know, it's a place where disease can get in and the onion won't store properly. And what you really want is more like this. See how this one pinches out. Now this, you know, the Rosa di Milano, I'm in kind of a transition zone, so the bulbs actually exhibit both. But if I took this onion up to British Columbia, probably every single one is going to have this nice pinched off neck. Now at the reverse of that, if you take an onion that was developed for Arizona and you bring it up to British Columbia, which is, so you go from a short day to a long day, what you end up having, you'll get a nice bulb, but it'll be like the size of a pea, you know, or because by the time the right day length has been reached, which is early in the season, the onion stops sending up leaves and begins bulbing. And so you've way underutilized its potential. So you've got to be able to understand that. Corn's another one where we have a huge day length issue. And you know, Bill's very familiar with this variety. This Native Seed Search has this in their collection. It's called Dia de San Juan. It's a white tortilla corn from southern Sonora in Mexico, and it's about 10 feet high in Arizona. Well, this was grown in central California, so it was originally developed at about 25 degrees north latitude, and this is about 38 here. And what happens is that it just, with those longer days, it just keeps like growing and growing and growing. And this grower here, he sent me an email because he was trying to grow this for seed, and he said, "Houston, we have a problem." But what I noticed was, see, there's, you know, I looked at his picture, and there's some pollen, some tassels started, and this was in August. And I said, "Matthew, not to worry. Don't worry, we're going to get it. It's just that the maturity date was 30 days longer than it was in Arizona, and the corn, instead of being 10 feet tall, was about 16. You know, but, you know, produced beautiful ears. But you just but if you take it too far north from the south, it'll just produce vegetation and no ears at all. So again, corn's another one that's critical. Spinach, another good crop when you're talking about day length, and which is why the Skagit Valley has become the most famous place for growing spinach, is because those long days afford the spinach to keep producing leaf for a long time before the right day length hits the flowers initiated. And here you can see, whoops, okay. Here you can see, this is the male right here, and here's the female. You know, we said these are dioecious plants. And this is abundant Bloomsdale variety, which is developed by OSA. And notice that really robust, vigorous leaf material here, which basically means you've got all that energy to put into the seed. So the seed yields in a place like the Skagit Valley are some of the best in the world. I mean, we can grow spinach seed down in California, and we do. But the leaves are a lot smaller because by the time they're ready to initiate flowering, the frame of the plant is much smaller. So your seed yields are going to be smaller. Okay, here's the Queen Anne's. Here's the Queen Anne's example that we talked about before. And I think carrots and Queen Anne identical. there's that flower in the upper left is a wild Queen Anne's lace flower, and the one on the lower right is a cultivated carrot flower. Pretty much the same darn thing. And when I was a rookie in the seed business, and I was going around, I was in the Northwest here, and I went to a grower who was growing a seed crop of carrots, and I knew about this. At least I knew about Queen Anne's lace to be warned about it. And I said, "Do you have any Queen Anne's lace?" He goes, "Oh, no." So I walked around his field, and I noticed a couple of plants of Queen Anne's lace maybe a quarter mile away, because I did a big loop around just to do my due diligence. And I came back and I said, I think you got a little bit of Queen Anne's lace here. And he goes, "Oh, don't worry, it's okay." Well, we got the seed from that crop, and we grew it out, and the next crop, we had 7% of the roots were white, which is Queen Anne's lace, and it's not edible. I mean, they are bitter, and so a gardener or a farmer planting that, 7% would have come up as white roots, not acceptable. And that was even with just a couple of plants. So a bad one for the Northwest. 5 minutes, yeah. So anyway, that's probably, in terms of the weedy relatives, that's probably the most critical one in terms of with all these families we're talking about. I mean, there are other ones, amaranth lamb's quarter and quinoa do a little crossing, and amaranth and pigweed, but pretty minor. So the carrot is the main one when we're talking about the weedy relatives. Okay. Now, in terms of disease pressure, and I think this one also, John's book, The Organic Seed Grower, does an excellent job of talking about seed-borne diseases and the implications. Now, some diseases, like this was a Chinese cabbage crop that I was growing, and I got, this is clubroot for any of you who know what that is, and it happens when you grow too many brassicas in a rotation after one another, and it tends to be in very acidic soils. Well, it's a problem that's relatively easy to correct with dolomitic lime, bringing the pH up, as well as just pulling it out of the rotation for a few years. So this is what I call a soil imbalance. And so this isn't a huge problem for a seed grower. But on the other hand, seed-borne diseases are, and you have to, and there's an excellent chart in his book which covers a lot of the main seed-borne diseases. And the real issue here is that the seed is the vector for a pathogen, and you could end up contaminating the next lot, and especially if you're selling seed commercially, it could be disastrous. This happens to be the early stages of black rot, Xanthomonas bacteria that can be devastating, and the seed is the primary means of spreading this pathogen. So you really have to know your diseases, and in this case, we can actually hot water treat this, like 122 degrees for 20 minutes or something, and that'll largely get rid of this one. Although there's a lot of seed-borne diseases, you can't do that. You don't have that option. So you really have to back up and make sure that you're starting with clean seed. Okay, pest predation is another thing that you have to deal with. This was a snap pea I was trying to grow for seed, and I got really excited, and it was great, and I had a good crop. And then I had about the nightmare of 100,000 red-winged blackbirds come in. And, well, I didn't get any seed on that. So you've got to be able to figure how you're going to deal with issues like that. Insect pest pressure also can be severe. Rime, of course, on cabbages or Chinese cabbage works great, but the thing is, if the pressure is so bad, and this is a crop that it's you've got if you have to keep it covered during the flowering time, then you're blocking pollinators from coming in. So you've got to be able to deal with that issue. Okay, So I'm just going to run through a couple of slides to get you thinking about the economic implications. So this, so when you are growing seed, there are some unique tasks that you need to consider. And Sebastian's going to talk in more detail about many of these here, the fertility in water, and the fact that compared to produce, you are going to have a delayed harvest. It's going to be in the field 1 to several months longer than a typical produce crop. And the harvest process itself, which I'll cover a little bit later. And then after lunch, we're going to be discussing cleaning techniques and cleaning and storage. So all of these things we need to look at, and including the marketing of how are we going to sell our seed. So, and I know it's a little painful for all of us as farmers to actually get the notebook out and start putting numbers on a piece of paper. But it's, I think, a really important exercise to carry out when, if we're going to achieve some success. So, the thing is when so looking at it versus a produce crop, the primary things we want to look at are identify what the fixed costs are, land, depreciation. The fixed costs in by and large are similar, except that there are some fixed cost equipment investments that are different in seed. But primarily we want to really look at those variable costs. And someone told me, a farmer recently said, well, whenever I do an analysis, economic analysis, I don't look at the amount of dollars I can earn per unit area. That's not my main driver. It's the amount of dollars I can earn per hour. The time is the number one deal breaker for him, and it makes sense because labor is going to be our primary expense. So even though maybe in that given area you may make more money growing seed versus growing produce, you've got this time factor you've got to really consider as well. And then we're going to have a workshop on Friday morning on the economics, and we're going to go through this in much more detail. So if any of you are interested in this part of it, please attend the workshop on Friday. And then I'm not going to belabor this, but it's doing enterprise budgets, creating a timeline through the season, what the different activities are, an estimate of how much labor you need, and also what your cash flow is during that period. And then the question is, are you paying yourself at least a minimum wage? And I think that we really, in the seed world, as I said before, we love it so much we don't even think about the economics. But at some point, that's not sustainable. And we really have to also get out of what I call the poverty consciousness and try to compete with the big boys in terms of pricing. We have to be real about what it's costing us. And if we're giving our product away, it's just not going to work. And then deciding who is the market that we're trying to serve beyond growing seed for ourselves. And the kind of, are we a wholesaler? Are we growing bulk seed that we're trying to sell to individual seed farmers and seed companies? Or are we a retailer and selling seed in small packs And that's been a strategy of a lot of the growers, many of which are here with their small seed companies, and also a very good strategy. So I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian now, and he'll run through the season for how to grow seed. Yeah, good point. The comment there was about the sprouting seed market, which is really a different market, because sprouting seed by its very nature requires very low cost seed. It's the only way that a sprouting operation can survive. Plus, you're only trying to grow the seed for a week or two. You're not talking about trying to create a mature crop. So the quality standards are very different, but you have to have the ability. You have to be tooled up and have the ability to grow large quantities to take advantage of economies of scale. The question was, in year 1, should I have a living wage, or should I wait till year 3, and if I don't, then I drop out? Well, that all depends on, how strong of a stomach you have, how strong of a constitution you have, or maybe. And I'll tell you that many of these operations get subsidized, unfortunately, but that's even a fact of life of just farming generally. And I heard that a statistic recently that most farmers lose money in the United States. Bill.
In our seed schools, we teach that, and it's just an observation, is that it takes about 5 years for a new seed producer, sellers, company to really become real in some sense, even in a local area. People will celebrate you, they'll like you, but then they'll go over here and buy their seeds. But after you're around for 4 or 5 years, all of a sudden something switches, and I don't know what that is. 4 or 5, 6 years, it's in there. So I would just say, however you scale your life, don't put all the eggs in that basket for at least 5 years. That's just my experience.
Thank you. Okay.
All right, great. So now we get to get our hands dirty. Thank you. And so curious, we were talking about economics. How many people here are hoping to make seed production an important part of their farm business? All right. And how many people are interested in growing seed but don't necessarily need to take it to that point? They're rather more interested in stewarding a variety or growing seed for themselves. Yep. And you can definitely do both too. So, one thing I thought about, obviously this whole economic thing, it all really depends on what your end goals are. And the same thing goes back to the chart that we were showing on what does well where. Because in a lot of places you can do a little bit of everything, but it's not going to be commercial quality or commercial yields more likely, So I could maybe grow a broccoli in Southern Oregon, but I'm going to get really poor yields. But that's fine if I just want it for myself and I just need a little bit of seed, or I want to share it, or I want to do a breeding project. It doesn't matter. But if I'm wanting to get into the national broccoli market, everybody's going to outcompete me. I can't meet their price point. I'm going to lose money. So, all of these questions really depend on what your goals are. So it was a little tricky trying to figure out what to talk about because, growing seed is different than growing vegetables or other crops, but in so many ways it's very much the same. You still have to grow your cover crops, you still have to go out there, you have to till, you have to get it ready, you have to apply compost, you have to do a nutrient budget, you have to do all the same things, so so I'm just going to focus on what's a little bit different, and hopefully you guys have the farming gardening part down. We're happy to take questions for any aspect of growing, but I'm not going to cover, the basics of what it would take to grow any crop, just a seed crop. So like I said, you just need to have established good general farm practices. And we're not going to go over that too much. But you guys have all been gardening and farming, so you know that timing, soil management, bed preparation, weed control. You have to develop strategies over the long term. You learn, how to do these things, what works, what doesn't, what works for your scale, what doesn't, what are you aspiring to. So what's a little bit more seed crop specific? We've got spacing, supports, irrigation, fertility, a few different pests and disease control. Isolation, purity, we already talked about, and variety maintenance. So those are the things I'm going to talk about. So for spacing, the idea is really not that different than most crops. What you want is to give the plant enough space to fully express itself. What plant density do you get the best yields if you're looking for good yields? And then, where are you pushing the boundaries of creating an environment that might be conducive to disease, right? So we all know good airflow is very important, especially to prevent fungal diseases on the leaves, etc. So this is I would say pretty intensively planted. This is a kale that we did a couple years ago, but at the same time, as the plant matured, it lost a lot of its leaves. It's not a very thick block, and so there was good airflow in there. We didn't have any disease problems. We had really high yields. It worked out great. But it's kind of one of those things where this is very climate dependent. I'm lucky to have a nice, warm, dry climate. If you're somewhere where it's a little more humid, a little cooler, you might want to space things out a little bit more. You're gonna find that out really quick. How susceptible are your crops to disease, and what is the right amount of airflow that you need to prevent it. The big thing about spacing with seed crops is, if you're new to it, and many of you are not, they obviously grow a lot bigger than they would otherwise. That's the same kale on the right that we just saw, So if you're just a veggie farmer, you're used to kale being 1.5 feet tall. Now all of a sudden it's 5 feet tall and much bigger. This is a garden cress. Normally you cut that as a salad mix, but these are individual, and it's thickly seeded. These are individual plants, probably 9 inches apart, and they're starting to get big. They're still in the vegetative stage. By the end of the season, it's just a solid mass. And that's at 30-inch row spacing, so beginning of the season, it's a lot of dirt and just a few plants, but eventually, by the end, it's going to be full. And that's the point where once it's flowering, you still want that disease prevention to be there. We're still a small-scale grower, and even in larger scale ag, my goal is for, I'll get to you in a sec, is for, at plant maturity that all the plants are touching. You got a solid canopy. You're trying to prevent, sunlight hitting the ground. You don't want more weeds coming up. And so that's always the goal, and you can play with plant density a little bit, but yeah. So here's, field in the spring. We've got, what do we got there? And that might be a Dwarf Bok Choy. And this is that same field a little bit later, so we've got a mustard green on the far left, we've got a lettuce, then we've got that Dwarf Bok Choy in the middle that we're harvesting, another lettuce, and then some more arugula on the right, so just like with anything, you plant tomatoes, they're all just tiny, one little row and 5-foot spacing or whatever, and pretty soon it's a jungle. So seed is the same thing, except if you're new to seed, you're not expecting those same crops to grow that big. Yeah.
In your pictures, it looks like you only use drip. Is that right? Or are you using any overhead? Or
We use overhead as well. I was experimenting with doing more drip and less overhead in the beginning phases, but no, going back to sprinklers to start, and we'll talk about that in a second. So support, especially when you're trying to do things on a relatively intensive scale, and in the seed world as a whole, these are minuscule plots of seed. That's 1,000 square feet. We do beds that are 100 feet long, 5 foot on center. So, really these are pretty tiny. But, the arugula, if I didn't put a row of T-posts and a string right there, it'd start, just leaning on the lettuce. If I had more land, and I've kind of felt cramped in what I've had so far, I could have left an empty bed there, and just mowed it or done something with it. But, I'm trying to kind of squeeze it in. And so supports are really helpful. But also, when you're doing, something as tall as golden frill mustard, and so many crops are, taller than me. If you're in a place that has wind, it can definitely blow over. So, my favorite is just to put a T-post every, 20 feet or something, and then I wait till it's pretty tall. I don't want to go out there with a bunch of string. If I can support a tall crop like that with just one string, that's perfect. And you can see that all I'm doing is the block. These are all self-supporting here in the middle. And then I just have the rows in between the crops to keep them from falling on each other. And then also if there is a windstorm, those guys will all hold each other up for the most part. And it's just the edges that are really susceptible to lodging or whatnot. So, I find myself tying up a lot more than I did as a vegetable grower. And sometimes, we still do small lots of things. This was just a trial of a little radish. But a lot of times, if I'm just doing one bed of something, I'll just put a row of T-posts down the middle, and then just a string to kind of keep it from falling out to the side. Yeah.
One string down both sides of the plant?
One string down both sides, yeah, exactly. We have a Farmall 100 that we do the initial cultivations on, and then we, hand weed at certain points too. We use a basket weeder to start. Once the plants are too big for that, a toolbar with some cultivating knives on it. And yeah, I try really hard not to let weed seeds go to seed on the farm. We have a lot of crops that become our weeds, but luckily those are mostly easy to kill, so it's not too bad. Yeah. So irrigation. So yeah, in this instance, this is Ruby Streaks mustard. This is May 6th, and we've been irrigating with sprinklers all along, which is fine. I mean, it's just a leafy crop. It's going to love the water on the top. There's no problems. We're doing our last cultivation here. You can see the toolbar with the shanks there, and then these are the two paths. Probably doing it maybe a little more aggressive than I'd like, but it works out. But my main point is, and my main strategy on the farm is, as much as possible, I'm using sprinklers because they're easy. It's easy. They get out of the way. If I had drip tape, I couldn't really cultivate with the tractor, unless I buried the drip tape. But that's a whole nother step. And so sprinklers I can take in and out. It doesn't bother anything. Works great. But then this is May 6th. 3 weeks later, here's that same crop. It's a lot taller, it's flowering. I definitely don't want to, start sprinkling it here. Not only, the bees are flying all around. They don't really want to get wet. It can slow down pollination a little bit. If it rains, that's fine. It's not going to hurt it. Maybe pollination slows down for a day or whatever, but that's not a big deal. But and then also we're thinking about disease pressure. As things start closing up, you have less airflow there for a while, so that's a really nice time to try to keep it as dry as you can. But the thing is, you really need to pay attention to that timing. So as soon as they get to that point, that's when you do that last cultivation, you bring out the drip tape and you lay it down. Because if you forget and you get to May 30th and you want to put drip tape, it's a pain in the rear. But I have tied drip tape to my ankle and crawled down the row a few times. So now I remember to not do that.
Farmers are great that way.
Tying it to the end of your hula hoe and squeezing that in between a row works too. So the other issue with the big thing with irrigation is, so once you get to that flowering stage, or once you get to that full canopy stage, for one, you want to let the flowers do their thing without getting them wet, and the bees, but then you also want to do that disease control. Once you pull a crop, like right here, when I was a veggie farmer, boom, right away, that gets planted with a cover crop, and it's got a sprinkler, and it's fine, because it's probably vegetables on either side. But now at this point, these lettuces are going to flower, and I don't want to get those wet. So that's the tricky thing on a small scale when you have these little plots. How do you manage them in terms of irrigation? So we can either, oftentimes I'll end up just leaving it fallow for a little bit. If I've got a little extra time, I could germinate a cover crop with some drip tape, or sometimes I'll run some mini sprinklers down the middle, turn the pressure down, and just make sure that it's not hitting the sides too much. And if it hits it a little bit, then it's okay, but try to minimize it. So, but if you're, so many of us I think are relatively small scale, and especially if you've integrated vegetables into the operation, if you didn't plan it ahead of time, before the season started, and then you ended up with, two crops that need two different management strategies and they're right next to each other, you don't really have a good way to deal with that. So, and that's definitely happened to me a ton of times. Fertility, all the basic principles apply. You want to take care of your soil structure, you want to create a healthy soil ecology, you want to feed them with cover crops, compost. So if you're a vegetable grower, you have to grow all these plants, and you're growing vegetable seed, you have to grow all these plants to that same stage, and then you have to take them to the next stage as well. Which doesn't necessarily mean they need too much more fertility, especially when it comes to nitrogen. Usually by that time they've reached that vegetative maturity, there's enough energy within that plant to fuel the next process of seed production and flowering. But you could use slightly more phosphorus, because you are creating these seeds and these flowers, and so there's this extra step.
What do you mean by lodging?
Lodging is when a plant grows too tall and then kind of falls over, especially in a windstorm or something. Yeah, weak stems. So if it was like really vigorous growth, and it's not very strong, and then it's easier for a windstorm to knock it down. But really for most of my crops, I haven't really changed it that much from what I was doing for vegetable production. So, and this is my income, so I am shooting for the best yields possible. So I try to, get that plant to be as optimum as I can, without pushing it too far. And yeah, my fertility program is we grow cover crops, and then we add compost to the point where I would be concerned about adding excess phosphorus or potassium to the ground. And then whatever the balance of my nutrient needs are, I'll do, feather meal or fishbone meal, or, you have a huge selection of organic amendments to supplement with, so.
Yeah, and he mentioned it there about the phosphorus, sort of glossed over it, but that is very important. And some experience I had with Seeds of Change is we went back and looked at all of our pepper seed lots that had been grown like 10 years earlier, 10 years earlier, and we knew the fields that had received colloidal rock phosphate versus those that hadn't. And the ones that had at least 3 to 5 years longer shelf life.
Wow,
So
nice.
that's a very important thing to pay attention to, is the phosphorus levels.
You know how you can do tissue testing for leaf for fertility management. Can you send, does anybody know if you can send seed in for a nutrient? That'd be interesting.
Yeah, I don't know.
Sprouted first. Then you can say the leaf.
Yeah, that's true.
Could you repeat the sources of phosphorus that you use?
Can I repeat what?
Could you repeat the sources of phosphorus that you use?
The source of the phosphorus?
The source is, or
The-
what kind of phosphorus?
Yeah, what source of the phosphorus? Well, we're recycling it, you know, through crop residues and cover crops. Compost, we apply compost that has phosphorus in it. And then if I need more, usually I turn to fishbone meal. It's, you know, it's good price per pound and seems like it's a decent product. So then there's pest and disease control, you know, and obviously you have to do this if you're a vegetable grower as well. You know, the key is finding the problems when they're small. So you've got to walk your fields very often, you know, I would say at least once a week. Look at everything really closely. When you see something, you want to find out what it is. So the cheap thing is to do the research yourself. That's where I start. If I can't figure it out, then there's all kinds of labs that you can send samples to. Hopefully, maybe you're close to somebody who knows these things and you can ask them. But having a positive ID is really important because without that, you don't really know how to manage it both in the short term and then also for the long term. You know, and so with any pests and disease, you know, what you want to do is you want to really understand what that pest and disease or how it operates, what's its seasonal cycle, what's its preferred environment, you know, what are the common management strategies, you know, and so once you know all of that, you can start creating preventative things for the next year. You know, as seed growers, as commercial seed growers, we really have to be careful about seedborne diseases because the last thing you want to do is be selling your disease all around the country. People aren't going to be happy when they buy it. And so, you know, one of the best resources is the back of John's book, which I heard is going to be available for sale. If you don't have one, it's a great resource. He goes through all the crops and what are the, you know, the primary and secondary seedborne diseases for those crops. So, you know, and really, I'm pretty disappointed with, you know, usually we all turn to the online world to find out what we want to know, but pictures of diseases suck on the internet. There's a niche market there. If you want to make a really nice disease website, I'll pay a subscription fee. But it's getting better. Usually you can find out what you need to know. You know, as a contract grower working for seed companies, oftentimes, you know, it's in their best interest to not have diseased seed. So, you know, if I can't ID it and I want a positive ID, I'll usually call them and they'll usually put the bill for me to send it to the lab and get that positive ID. So, you know, don't feel, I mean, especially if you're growing it for someone else, don't feel like, you know, it's all on your shoulders. It's, you know, if they say no, you know, I'd probably still send it to the lab. But oftentimes they're more than willing to at least partner in that process. You know, so what are some good strategies? I mean, these are a combination of pest and disease. You know, with disease, you want good stock seed. So you're hoping that the seed that's coming into your farm doesn't have disease already on it. You can talk to the people who you're getting the seed from. You know, sometimes that's not possible. So you really want to pay attention. One of the things that you're doing when you're out there in the field looking at things that are coming up, or you're in the greenhouse looking at things coming up, does it look healthy? Does it look normal? You know, if you plant a lettuce and it's coming up and, you know, you got lettuce this size and all of a sudden you're noticing it's all virus, you know, just get that out of there. I mean, unless there's a really reason not to, but. So where do you learn how to hot water bath your seed? Jared will know.
There's some good information actually on eOrganic. that has, for not for all crop types, but for certain crop types, some of the time and temperature requirements. I believe that Lindsay DeToy, who's here, Washington State Seed Pathology, has developed some guidelines as well. You could check out her website.
You know, and we have different types of farms. So, one really long-term strategy is to import less seed from your farm, or, less seed that you don't know its origin. But, that's a long-term goal maybe. So disease and pest-resistant varieties, we're always looking for those, or we're always trying to breed for those. If something is always disease-prone, that's just a challenge, and unless you want to take it as a breeding project, maybe you're just better off working with another variety. So, we talked about airflow. You can work with the prevailing winds to help keep the crop air moving through there. We talked about spacing. And then pruning is the other thing, so, things like trellis tomatoes, you can go through and just pull off all the leaves on the bottom foot, let some air get in there, that'll make a big difference. That is time consuming. I sometimes with tomatoes, they grow so lush in Southern Oregon, I'll take a hedge trimmer and just kind of knock them back a little bit. Especially at the end of the season when they reach the top of my trellis and then they start folding over and things are getting a little congested. Just take a hedge trimmer and cut it off. A lot of those last fruits aren't going to really be good seed producers for me. They might not be ripe enough by the end of the season. So, with vigorous plants like that, feel free to hack at them. They'll survive. And with some diseases, you can send samples into labs. Send your seed in at the end of the season and say, will you test for these pathogens? And they can send you a report. So, especially with big lots that are worth a lot of money, some seed companies might require it. Some of them might do that themselves. That's a discussion you can have. But well, I think here in Oregon, to send it to OSU is $60. Washington, to send it to WSU is like 20 or something. It's a lot less. So maybe you can pretend you're from Washington. Yeah. So how many varieties and species do we grow a year? We probably, for commercial production, we do maybe 30 varieties of, 15 species. And then, usually we're always experimenting with another dozen things. How does growing so many species work out for me? Well, I'm lucky to live in a climate where I can do a pretty wide range and do them well. So, I'm always experimenting to figure out what does well and what doesn't. And then once I know I can do a species well, then when I'm talking with seed companies, I can say, well, I'm not doing this species yet for anybody else. I've got an isolation for it. Do you have any needs for this species? We're small still, so oftentimes I can only do one variety of one of each species of the cross-pollinated crops. But yeah, no, it works out good. Diversity is great. So I think that just helps with our overall farm ecology. And spreads out labor, spreads out risk. That's a really nice thing to spread out risk. Yeah. So the question is, would I grow hybrids? There is a demand for hybrids. In some areas, they feel a need for hybrids. I think there's definitely a place for hybrids in the world. I plant hybrids for some of my fresh production. Growing hybrids is, well, there's two ways you could grow hybrids. You could, try to grow your own hybrid, and then you inbreed, and you got your mother line and your father line, and you're saving these 3 varieties, and 2 of them totally suck. Or you could grow a hybrid for somebody else, and they send you those parent lines. And I wouldn't be opposed to that. You plant 1 row of papa and 4 rows of mama, and Yep, save the seed on the mamas. I'm okay with that. I mean, my desire is to work with breeding more open-pollinated and working on creating varieties that are suitable for whatever the needs are. So, I mean, and the hybrids, I mean, you can do some hybrids without crossing certain ethical boundaries, and then some hybrids, it's a little harder to do that. And there'll be more classes on that here. Let's see, we should move on. Roguing. Well, we talked about that. Yeah, as soon as I see something, it's out. It's out of the field. If it's something that I'm worried is going to spread, it goes into a plastic bag and it leaves the farm. If I'm not too worried about it in the short term, it goes into the burn pile for the end of the year. We're talking about pest and disease. I mean, I wrote varieties there because sometimes you plant a variety and yeah, the whole variety is just junk, just get it off the farm before it causes you more problems.
You don't compost it, because then it stays in the soil.
Well, it depends what it is, So if it was a lettuce virus, yeah, I'll just till it in. I'm not, it's not going to come back and bite me. If it's something else, I mean, I don't know. When it comes to pests, mostly it's the same pests. There are a few seed-specific pests. Up in Washington, right before I left, the cabbage seed weevil was kind of causing some problems on some cabbage crops. So it's a weevil. It lays an egg in the pod, the seed pod, the larva, crawls up and down the pod, eats the immature seeds, and then pupates and climbs itself out. So you'll find these pods that have a little exit hole, and a few seeds will be gone. Lygus bug is a big problem here on the West Coast. So they'll damage the immature developing seed, and then it doesn't develop right. And so it's all in that top line. You got to just be paying attention. Find out, who's causing the problem, and then what are your options to manage it. I experimented with some snap peas a few years ago, and they looked great. And I was new to the area, and then I started threshing them, and 1 in every 10 peas was bored out, for the most part. Oh gosh, what's the insect? The pea weevil, yeah. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to ever grow pea again. I don't want to row cover my peas, on a trellis or anything else, even on the ground. And so I'm just going to let that one go. It's not worth my time and energy to fight it, because it was such a, there's such a high population there. But yeah, so, our main strategies for, crops that generally do well in our area, is have lots of flowers, insectary rows, so there's something always flowering at any given time. We do use a lot of row cover. I don't really use a lot of trap crops, but I do. A trap crop is you plant another crop that's more enticing than your seed crop. So, like with the cabbage seed weevil and canola up in Canada, a lot of times they'll plant an early maturing canola or brassica around the fields so that it flowers, maybe 2 weeks earlier than the rest of the field. All the weevils are attracted to that, and then you go through, you till in that border row, and, you've basically killed a lot of those weevils, and then the rest of the season you have a little less pressure on your field. So yeah, you can, through tillage or, you could spray something on to kill. You're basically trying to attract the insects to one area where you can deal with them and they're not on your crop. With row covers, so we do spring planted brassicas. We have, root maggots, so, with a lot of these insects, it's just like with vegetables, if you can get them to semi-mature stage, they're going to outgrow any other pest pressure that, comes after that. And the great thing about, growing seed is if I have flea beetle holes in my arugula, I don't, really care because no one's ever going to know. They're going to get the seed and that's fine. So, when you're counting on it as a living, at one point in your toolbox, you've always got soap, you've got pyrethrum, you got all kinds of tools, if you need them. And that's really just, it's an ethical and it's a financial decision, that everybody makes differently. So then isolation, you got 3 strategies to keep varietal purity, especially if you're growing more than one of a species, but also depending on who's around you and what they're doing. So the first and easiest one is space. And Jared talked a lot about that. Where on the spectrum of sulfur and crosser is it? How much space does it require? As a contract grower, most seed companies, in the contract, they'll request a certain isolation distance that you need to meet. If we do have several fields scattered around where we're at, and just this year, finally, I'm going to have a field that's 1.25 miles away from my other field. So, at that point, with enough of orchards in between, I feel like I can maybe do some insect-pollinated crops over there at the second isolation. So space is always the easiest thing, because you don't really have to do anything special once once it's in its spot. Time, I haven't used that one, really. I mean, what are crops that you could do that with? I guess corn maybe is an option. That would be easy, an early corn and a late corn. What are some other examples?
Something that's really, fast to mature. Might be some annual brassicas that you could pull it off with. Maybe you're going to say this, but of course the trick with any of those is there's that tendency for things to catch up. You say, okay, I'm going to plant this really early and plant this one really late, and then it turns out they're catching up in the middle of the year.
Yeah, definitely experiment on a small scale if that's what you're going to do, because, and yeah, you're right, weather can totally change all your plans with that. So if you don't have the space and you're not sure about the time, then the only other foolproof method, well, nothing's really foolproof, but is barriers. And so this is an example of barriers on my place. This is just 1/2-inch conduit bent into that shape. These are peppers. So we had another pepper that I couldn't isolate quite far enough. And so, it's uncovered right now because I don't know what they're doing. I think they might be adding a string to those peppers. But normally, and I wish I had a picture of, the row cover on top, but I've got a picture of the peppers underneath the row cover. But basically, I'm just using row cover as an insect barrier, so that you're preventing cross-pollination. And luckily, peppers can readily self-pollinate, so even if I don't have a lot of pollinators underneath, that's okay. They're still going to do their thing. I could do that with eggplant as well. When you start growing big crops, the row cover thing doesn't really work, especially if you have wind. So you need something definitely a little bit more substantial. This is a picture from Seed Savers Exchange, and so they've got these, 7-foot tall, 6-foot tall little, mini greenhouses with, instead of plastic, it's insect netting.
What kind of insects you deal with on the peppers?
Well, there it's less, it's not really for pest control, it's for, to keep the bees off of it.
Yeah, I just wondered what kind of pests you deal with.
With peppers, I don't get that many pests, sometimes we get, and I'm not even sure what it is, but it'll bite the fruit and leave a little, scar on it.
Pepper weevil.
Pepper weevil?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you telling me or
Yeah,
asking
no,
me?
just asking if that's the pepper we.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't ID'd it.
You get a lot of mice.
Yeah, mice, absolutely. They love peppers. I mean, and you know, all the low-hanging fruits, they'll just nibble up on the bottoms. You know, if you're a fresh market tomato grower and you want that mix of heirloom tomatoes on your table for farmers market, but you're not going to want to isolate your tomatoes all around the farm, you know, before they open, and you want to guarantee yourself that you're going to get a selfer, you know, you can always just protect that flower from any external pollen, you know, whether it's brought in by an insect or otherwise. I mean, you can do this with a lot of different species. The other thing you would also cover is another, you know, foolproof way is you hand pollinate. And I need to wrap this up. So yeah, but you can hand pollinate. You can take pollen from a male flower, you know, apply it to a female flower. You know, you usually seal it. What's that? Sorry. Usually seal it the night before it opens. You know, I mean, I'm thinking of squash, I guess, right now. But you can do this with other crops as well. And then you seal it after you pollinate it. So, you know, you're very conscious of, you know, where all the pollen is coming from in that particular situation. And then variety maintenance and roguing is really important. This was talked about a little bit already. You know, the ideal situation is all the crops that, you know, all the traits that you're really or mostly interested in are visible before the flowering stage. You know, so in this Dwarf Bok Choy situation, I mean, it's really easy now to just go through the field and, you know, as soon as you see one that you wouldn't want, if you were a Bok Choy commercial farmer, you know, you just kill it, you know, got a few holes here, you know, I mean, this was a pretty good variety, so I didn't have to kill too many. You know, and this all just depends on what your personal goals are, you know, so, you know, we were going through carrots yesterday, and I was only keeping the best 30%. You know, here we're keeping the best 95%. So, you know, it's how much selection pressure do you want to apply? But the key is, you know, just make sure you rogue, because, you know, and these guys already explained it. You know, if you're not doing that, you're inherently evolving that variety, whether you're doing it consciously or not. So if you don't do anything, you know, it's going to be a little bit different the next time, but it's going to include all the individual plants that, you know, you wouldn't have necessarily wanted to include. So, you know, at least go out there and get rid of all the ones that are, you know, obviously not healthy, not productive, disease prone, this or that, you know. I mean, when it's your living, you know each plant is, you know, is another few dollars off your income, but in the long run, it's going to pay off very much.
Great. Thanks, Sebastian. Okay, I'm just going to talk a few minutes about the actual harvest of the crop and getting it off the field, at least as a rough, clean material. So because the idea is, you know, when you take it off, you want to kind of reduce the amount of material that you've got. And so I think when you're getting prepared for this, you know, one of the key things is having a space to work. And this is an example here, a grower that I've worked with, that, you know, just a little hoop house here, you know, a nice dry, airy space that you can lay out tarps, and when you cut crops and you bring them in, at least before you even work on them anymore, you want to allow them to dry more, you know, oftentimes, because then you're able to begin the threshing process. And, you know, screen tables is a really great, really great thing to have. I mean, not just for corn here, but really any crop that you want to lay out a crop to allow it to dry. And I think that drying step is really key, because if you're in a situation where you've bundled the seed in a bag or a bucket or something, and it collects moisture, you're really you're just welcoming mold and disease problems. And then having a nice, finished drying space that, you can lay stuff out. The other spot was the first slide I showed was kind of your rough cleaning, but after you've done your threshing, you want to be able to lay things out on tarps or screens and then really be able to inspect the whole crop. And it's, good when you're really trying to attain good quality. You really have to almost lay the seed out in a single layer, the entire crop, so you can really see what you've got. Because if you just pile it up, it's really hard, and you may have a lot of weed seeds in there and other things that you don't even see unless you actually are able to get it out and spread it out into a single layer. Do you have the people power? Because some of these crops aren't very forgiving in terms of their harvest window, and you've got to be ready to go at that moment. You can't. Some of them, as we'll discuss here, you can wait a little bit, but some you've really got to get on it right away. And then, so I made this chart kind of the 9 major vegetable crop families, sort of from the most we're shattering. And shattering is when the crop begins to ripen, seed begins to fall on the ground. So potential loss. And the most shatter susceptible crops are at the top, and then the least at the bottom here. So obviously at the bottom, things like corn and the squash and the tomatoes, there's no issue at all because they're in a moist fruit. But for the dry-seeded crops, there is an issue, and particularly lettuce is maybe the most critical in that sense. Also, onions and are also quite significant, and then on down, carrots are also kind of critical. Some of them, like beans, maybe not so much, depending on the variety. But you need to know when you observe the ripening process that, with these shattered crops, that you've really got to get on it. So, and here's a crop of lettuce, which is really just beginning to shatter right now, but it's only the initial ripened seed, and there's a lot of immature seed on this. So one of the ways is to go in and with a pail, a big 55-gallon pail or something, and start shaking lettuce into a bucket. And I know the growers I worked with cursed about that. They hated that. Like 3, 4, 5 harvests. Some people actually like it, but a lot of people don't. And so and I think Frank Morton was one, with Wild Garden Seed, who really perfected this method of cutting the lettuce prior to maturity. You start getting shattering, but you cut the whole crop when it's about maybe 75% mature. Then you lay it on tarps to complete the drying, and any shattered seed drops onto the tarps. And so you actually are able to recover a much larger percentage of the mature seed. And of course, with the fruited crops, you're just, really trying to get absolutely mature fruits before you even harvest. And so, for example, a tomato that looks really good for eating, it's nice and red, but it's not like that super, almost over mature, almost to the point of beginning to rot a little bit. That's really the ideal. And these peppers, they're absolutely red ripe. Okay, some of the crops, like broccoli here, you kind of have to look at the overall plant and gauge when it's ready to harvest, kind of based on its color. And you can see the seed pods are pretty brown here, and most of this dry seed that's ready to go is going to take on that buff tan color. But you'll also notice that the plant itself is still green, and but this is definitely ready to go. This plant, and the fact that it hasn't had any shattered seed. Some brassicas vary, some of them are a little more susceptible to shattering. And if you begin to see that the pod's open and you're starting to lose seed, harvest it at that point. But most of the time with these, shattering is not an issue with brassicas. And then like with beans, I mean, like since this is a bush bean that's going to mature over time, you'll see some green beans on here, and then others that are obviously ready to go. Just let it go all the way. Unless of course you're losing seed to the ground. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the threshing process, and then Jared's going to continue with kind of an overview of seed cleaning and storage. And then we'll take a break around 3:30. And our last session, we're going to go through the crops, some crop examples. Then hopefully we'll have a little time at the end for some varietal improvement techniques and practices. Okay. All right. So going back to the threshing here, and just to review that, really the idea of the threshing is to get rid of all that most 90% of the chaff and sticks and extraneous material is going to get removed through threshing. So at a small scale, hand threshing is sufficient. And when you're getting into it, that's what I would suggest. Start small, get used to what the whole process is. And before you start thinking about investing in lots of mechanical equipment, see what you can do by hand. And you'd probably surprise yourself what you actually could accomplish with hand equipment. Tarps, Rubbermaid totes, box fans, and homemade screens. The precision screens that we mentioned out there, we will have at the end, we'll be able to give you a couple of sources where to buy those precision screens. So if any of you are interested in that, come up here at the end. Okay, and this was my screen that I had outside, that homemade 3x3 screen just made from hardware cloth that you can get at the local hardware store. And it's great because it's large enough that you can run quite a bit of material through there in a relatively small amount of time. So this is the rough scalping stage, basically. So all those stems and all those pods, that's compost. And all your onion seed, in this case, is falling through to the bin below. Now, if you get kind of the next scale up, and so did everybody get to see that belt thresher out there? Okay. Yeah, this is a little larger unit here, but it's basically, the belt thresher is those two belts that are running opposite of one another, and it really takes the place of, like obviously in bigger volumes, you don't want to be pushing everything with your hands. Even with a pair of gloves, you wear gloves out in a hurry and get awful tired. So at the next scale, you've got a belt thresher, and I don't know, we're probably talking about, I don't know what a used belt thresher would be, maybe you guys know, but we're probably talking about, for a new one, is probably going to run you at least $15,000. And Jared,
that would be 25.
That would be 25? Okay. See, that's how much I'm out of it, because I remember 10 years ago they were like, they've gone up.
And you can't find, it's so hard to find a used one.
Yeah, that's the issue with like a belt thresher. Now, old combines is a different story. You might be able to find some of these old beaters for a few $100. But so at this scale, this is something that should probably be cooperatively owned, with a seed co-op, unless you are really doing, more major volumes and you can actually afford to to invest in that. And really, when you're talking about mechanical equipment, you could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on, and get fancier and fancier. But you have to be able to justify it by the amount of seed that you're actually selling. Okay, at the next scale, thank you, Patty, for this, and Patty and Nash and Squim, Washington. This is on their farm. Windrowing, this I think is a brassica crop. I'm not sure. But so when I talked about, I showed earlier that when I was holding that broccoli plant ready to harvest, and I was doing those, cutting them by hand because I had a small plot. Well, at this scale, you probably want a cutter bar to go through to be able to windrow it. And then you allow the material to dry in the field for a few more days. And then you come and pick it up with a combine. And a combine really is a combination of threshing, breaking it off, breaking the seed away from the sticks and trash, and then running it through screens. So it's got a set of screens inside the machine. So, and then this is on the inside of an all-crop combine, and that was the go-to combine in the 50s and 60s before these modern combines. I mean, it did all-crop. It had screens for just about every crop you could think of. And what it is here, you see there's like 2 scalping screens. Like on the top, let's see, here we go. Whoops. Oh boy.
You can go back.
Yeah, okay. Let's see. This top screen right here is larger holes. So the largest hole. So the combine is like threshing this thing inside the guts. It's just rubbing with rollers or bars, and so it's breaking it away from all the sticks and plant material. And then it comes into this chamber, and it drops through that first scalping screen, and then eliminates all that big trash. Then there's a middle screen here, which also basically is a scalper. But it's smaller holes. So it's and it works better when you've eliminated the first bunch of trash. So now there's less trash for it to deal with, and then then the seed falls through down to here, and then so you get this next bunch of the next largest size of trash gets eliminated. And then on the bottom, you've got a very small screen that's smaller than your seed, and that eliminates dust and small weed seed and everything. So your good seed is right in here, like this, and then that gets taken to another compartment in the combine. So that's the basic, and we do this as we're showing out there with the hand screens. It's the same basic principle.